me and you, we kind of come at, I guess Hassan's our synthesis over there, but we we come at these issues, it seems, from a different angle. It just hearing about disputes like this, because I had this actually similar um, investigation to the early history, like the pre-Nicene history of baptismal theology, like whether paedobaptism actually pre-Nicene, and when you read the history even of that, it actually is a lot less clear than people would like to
Yes.
admit. The fact that infants were baptized by the apostles, it is much less clear. It's actually quite messy, and it kind of leads me to ask: is what is the theological value of discerning um, the trying to discern like the sort of majority opinion in a certain era of church history? Like what is the sort of value but beyond, that's interesting, like, because it seems to me that um eventual consensus, I know it just sounds like really bad for me to put it like this, but like eventual consensus, arguing from scripture as the primary source of theology, looking at magisterial declarations, that stuff like that seems just a loads clearer than trying to sector out parts of church history and look to see what the belief was in this or that era.
Yeah. No, I agree. In fact, when Dr. Gavin Ortland showed up and was doing precisely that,
Mm.
it's sort of like a museum type. In other words, he comes into history. And by the way, I'm not trying to insult Dr. Orland here. He's a great man, and I view him as a friend. But the way he conducts the historical investigation is kind of like going into a museum and looking at the available artifacts that are there, which are not, it's not much. I mean, what we have reconstructed about previous eras and epochs of paleontology or archaeology, if we were to somehow miraculously be transported back to those times, we would be laughing at a lot of the things that we today say about it, because we just don't, we're very limited in what we're trying to reconstruct from the artifacts of history, and there's so much going back and forth in the historiography in academia on these things. So I agree with you that the the museum route doesn't often give enough clarity, and so that's why the Catholic Church, I agree with Cardinal Manning. He's often denigrated by people online,
Mm.
but if you read Cardinal Manning's works, he's often misportrayed. But I think that what we need to know about the Christian faith, it's the most pristine way to do it is to see, what does the church believe now. I mean, that's the Irenaean canon.
Mm.
What do all the churches believe? Um, so I definitely don't want to say that the way we know Christian doctrine, or the way that we can defend Catholic dogma the most, is by presenting historical clarity. And my article on the Assumption of Mary is a case in point with that. I admit to Dr. Gavin that the first 5 centuries, we don't have a case, a persuasive case, that this is going back to apostolic times. But the good news is that we don't come to the definition of dogma through this historical methodology,
Mm.
right? So that's clear. So my hesitations on the issue with magisterium are simply because of what the magisterium has said in the past, not the historical evidence surrounding it. So, for example, Pope Honorius. Um, in my research on Pope Honorius, I think that we penetrate into magisterial action because of the way in which he was anathematized by Rome itself. So a lot of Catholic theologians in the past have said, well, he was not condemned for heresy. He was condemned for negligence, being inattentive to his duties, or simply watching a heresy run its course, not because he himself had any positive contribution to that error. And many smart people have come to that. Many people who are smarter than I am who have come to that resolution. And I just don't see that as a feasible option. And so what that leaves me with is seeing that the magisterium itself, basically the last thing that our church has said through its official documents on Pope Honorius, is that he both believed, defended, and magisterially uttered monothelitism. And so that's not a historical artifact. That's an instantiation of the magisterium.
Mm-hmm.
That as far as as far as I know, no pope has ever said, "Oh yeah, we said that in the past, but we don't. We're going to go ahead and reverse that." Um, so I think that is a sufficient barrier for me to say that the magisterial safety, the objectivist magisterial safety view, has it has a problem in its path, unless Pope Francis comes out and says, "Hey, we noticed that there's some issues with what the Pope Leo II and what the Sixth Council and the Seventh and Eighth Councils have said about Honorius. We're going to set the record straight and say this." Well, if that happened, then that would overcome that for me. Do you see? Same thing with Vigilius. So if the magisterium actually addressed it and then moved it out of the way for me, then I would say, okay, now we've got a better route for this idea that the Pope could never really, go to the degree of heresy in his magisterium.
That's very, very interesting. I actually quite agree with that approach, and I feel like a lot of the opposition to the approach that you laid out with the relationship between history and the magisterium, it's very naive because rarely is anything clear cut. I can I can't count, maybe like the Apostles' Creed, like that is like the sort of clear cut, 2,000 years of church history sort of thing. But I actually think that this is the genuine interpretation of St. John Henry Newman's quip that to be deep in church history is to cease to be Protestant. It isn't because it's so clear; it's actually because it's so messy.
Yeah,
And that's
says.
actually that's the context of why St. Newman even made that statement, and it just flies over so many people's heads where they post it like, yeah, because nobody ever believed, all of these Protestant doctrines before the Reformation and blah 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 blah. That's usually how people will abuse that quote, but really the quote is actually exactly related to what we are talking about right now.